This is pre thingy. Okay, so
Premeditated stuff.
yes. Right. Who does the intro?
I don't mind. Whoever.
Hello and welcome back to PlayUp and Chat, the podcast that talks about games and gaming. And today we're going to be talking about something a little heated, actually. We have quite a big debate preparing for this episode. Before we continue, you're listening to me, Benji.
I'm not talking to you.
Why not? Come on.
No.
Come on, bro. Come on.
This is Don Chap. I'm talking to my audience. Hi, this is Don Chap.
Yes, audience, you see, we are coming from a very heated debate, actually, about today's topic, because we're talking about expansions and whether or not they make board games better or perhaps worse. And we split up our topic today into, as we usually do, we have a nice little list and we got each little compartments in there and we're going to be talking about them individually. And we had quite a few disagreements, didn't we, Don?
You wrote the 3 points. I had nothing to do with this.
Hey, you were actively discussing with me in this, okay?
Oh, it was a discussion. It started off as a discussion. It did end as one.
Yes, okay. So,
If you like what we do here at PlayUp, you can go ahead and support us through patreon.com/PlayUpMT.
yeah, and you can keep up to date with everything that we post on all our socials. So that's Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, and we stream on Twitch as well.
Yes, for PlayUp Legends, the D&D campaign.
Awesome. So let's jump right in back to this argument. Do expansions make the game better or worse? Don, first off, what are expansions?
Well, the way you would start it off, in my understanding, right?
Yes. Let's see.
In my understanding, expansions is something that you add on to the base game, for the most part, that adds to what you already have. Right? And I'm not going to get into the whole subject of the other part where we argued. I don't know.
Yes, that is.
We'll argue about it later.
Yes, that is indeed an honorable mention at the end of the show because of our disagreement. But how I see it, and it is fairly similar to how you just described it, is yes, you're adding on new things or there's a bunch of new things, and we'll discuss that in a minute, to the original base game. That either make it more interesting, perhaps more difficult, perhaps more annoying, but it adds some new element to the game that changes the game in some way, right?
Yep.
Yes, indeed. And on our list, and the first topic of discussion here is that there are some kind of expansions that add more stuff. Now, you might say to us, but Benji, Don, don't all expansions add new stuff?
Yes, well, listen, I mean, we're being a bit more specific. Not just more stuff as in mechanic-wise and all that. We're meaning stuff. I mean components. I mean, I think it's more components that we're talking about that doesn't change anything from the base game itself, right?
Yeah.
We're not even going to mention about adding new players. It's just basically adding more flavor, more fluff, more components that don't change or add anything else to the base rules of the game. Let's put it like that, per se. It just introduces new playability, new outcomes from the same scenarios that you already have. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, so like if we had to take an example, and we'll go to the board game that we always go to when we give examples.
Our gateway board game.
Our gateway board game. That is Betrayal at House on a Hill. We see that the expansion for the original base game adds more board pieces. It adds more haunts, essentially, but it doesn't change the core mechanic of the game, which is essentially exploring the house, uncovering board pieces, and then triggering the haunt, and either together cooperatively or perhaps competitively group against one, defeating the haunt that has been triggered. So essentially, what has changed? Core mechanically, nothing, but more stuff has been added. And it is of our opinion that some of the haunts introduced in this game aren't exactly quite up to scratch as the original ones, aren't they, Don?
They are horrible. I'm sorry. If I could look, if I'm not mistaken, Wizards of the Coast had a hand in this. Wizards, guys, come on. I mean, you're starting to trip up. It's been a while since you're tripping up on certain games, on certain mechanics that you touch. Like, you're my favorite guys. Come on, why did you do this to Betrayal, man? Like, it really. First and foremost, okay, you might be asking, Don, what are you on about? Why does the new haunts, the new 50 haunts added to the core mechanical game? Why are they different? Why are they worse, in your opinion? Here's why. First and foremost, they're very vague when it comes to the rulings. Thematically, they're cool, and I see the attraction towards them. However, the major problem that I find in the new ones is there's a lot of room for misunderstanding. There's a lot of room for error. Interpretation, it depends on the individual, how they interpret the new haunts and how they go about doing them. Unlike the base game, where it's very much in your face, this is the way it has to go down. These are the new rules added for the person who turned traitor, and here's the new mechanics that can be added for the heroes that are not treacherous. In the new one, it's very much like vague. Like, you have to guess how you're gonna go about with these new mechanics. It's frustrating.
Yeah.
Some of them are even like, why? Like, it just extends to the point where the game doesn't want to end. I know one of the haunts in specific, and I don't mean to spoil this for anyone, but one of the haunts actually turns the house into this thing which wants to kind of ride off the cliff. So basically, you're moving the house towards the edge of the table, and now everyone's an owl and they can fly around the house. It just becomes very prolonging. You know, it's very much it's annoying overall. I don't even want to elaborate more than that. It's just, guys, whoever created the expansion, kudos on you, adding the wall, adding the new floor, adding the new rooms, adding the dumb. I mean, there are good things about the expansion. If I could just remove the tiles that instigate and one of the new haunts, I would. That's the only thing I'd do, because the haunts are terribly written.
Yeah.
That's my opinion, by the way.
No, it's good that we're discussing this, because it gives our listeners a chance to experience some feedback from some of these expansions that we'll be talking about today before they put their money down and purchase them. Because, of course, expansions can be expensive sometimes, and maybe you're wondering, but how much do they actually add to the game? And if we're thinking about adding, as in this particular subtitle that we have first with the more stuff, we can talk about detective games. Now, there are loads of detective games out there. Speaking for me and Don, we're not particularly huge fans of detective games, so we won't stay here long. But we can see that a lot of the expansions that do come out with these kind of games add more replayability, in the sense that if you play through a mystery game once, you know the ending. You know you've solved the mystery. You've essentially completed it, and replaying it would just be metagaming, in that sense that you know what's coming. So expansions here add new mysteries, they add new stories and new content to delve into. Essentially, that can be a good thing and a great thing if you do enjoy these kind of detective games. However, moving on to perhaps maybe something that has a little bit of an element of detective and mystery in it, it's the name actually Mysterium. Now, Mysterium is a game where you're given a certain number of clues, right? And you have to figure out sort of who.
Think of it like Cluedo.
Yeah, like
right?
who did
Or
what,
Clue.
kind of.
So, but rather than trying to figure out things randomly with clues, that's you're trying to guess yourself in certain rooms. This is more a step-by-step base where there's a mute player acting as the deceased, the ghost that passed away, and is trying to remind everyone who was involved, where and what items were around at the time, which then leads up to, once you have all the people and the places and the items, then it kind of boils down to who actually did it, where, and with what.
Yeah.
You're doing this in the progress of basically the let's call him the game master. The ghost is the
Yes,
game
the
master.
game master. It's a good way to refer to
He's
them.
going to basically pass down these really weird looking cards with this abstract illustration on them to give you a hint towards who's, or where or what the people involved or items or places involved were. Once everyone guessed, and I think there's a limited amount of rounds to do this.
There are, yes, they're actually done.
Unlike Cluedo, where basically it's who manages to guess it first. This is more a collaborative game where people can help each other. So basically, the way it works is that everyone's helping each other to guess and interpret these cards to guess who was involved, and towards the end, you guess who it actually was. What the expansion is doing is just adding more cards for the illustrations, for the clues, for the involvement, the place, the person, the weapon. It just adds on to that, because sometimes the replayability, as fun as it is, I think more on the side of
you're gonna have to get really creative with finding new ways to show these abstract cards, aren't you?
Exactly. So the new abstract cards are my favorite part of the expansion, because it just gives you more ideas of how to interpret certain things. Because at the end of the day, especially if you have the same playing group and you played Mysterium a couple of times, they're going to realize you're going to use a certain cards to represent a certain person, and then they kind of meta game the way they're interpreting the cards, because it is easier that way and makes it much more easier, not so challenging, so to speak, to finish the game. So the expansion is going to add that here's more flavor for you guys to keep playing your favorite game. That's what it's essentially doing.
Yeah, it definitely does add some sort of sense of replayability there. And for sure, with the more components, with the cards. And actually, speaking about more cards, another game that we've written down here as an example of adding more stuff is, in fact, Smash Up. Now, Smash Up was originally designed, its actual base game, where you've got different themes, different decks of cards that are themed, like, for example, monsters, zombies, dinosaurs, things like that. And you take two decks, combine them together, and you've got a fighting deck, and then which you compete, you play against other players. You challenge players with your combination of themes. And the expansions to Smash Up, all they do really is they're adding more cards, so essentially more themes to the game. Now, people might argue, yes, it adds more mechanics, but the core mechanic of the game, in and so being that you choose two decks of cards and two different themes of cards, smash them up together, literally in the name, and then challenge your opponent and see who manages to come out on top with their two different themes. That core mechanic essentially stays the same. And even in the base game, each themed deck has different mechanics anyway. So we are essentially adding more of the same kind of stuff. Now, does it make the game better? I mean, it definitely makes it more interesting in the sense that you can now have you could have, whereas before you could just perhaps goblins and vampires, you can now have mechazoid dinosaurs, it's just...
And My Little Ponies.
And My Little Ponies as well, even added there. So, yes, it adds a little bit more fun. If this is the kind of game that really your friend group might enjoy, and it's great to see a little bit of difference and what are we going to put together, all well and good. We've had some experience playing the game. It's maybe perhaps not one of our favorite games, but it does pass the time, and having more choice to choose from definitely, I think, is a plus.
Yeah, I mean, this is what we mean by is adding more stuff. So you like the core game, you're just getting bored of playing the same content that's inside the box. Now it's like, okay, here's an expansion to shake it up a bit. We know the game is just adding these new flavors, new pieces, so to speak, to the essence of the base game. However, I think some board games lack the play. If you were like us a couple of years back, 2-3 years back now, and we were a big group of people, We all love to play board games, but most board games have a limit of players. So we end up playing mostly social deduction games because of this. That's where certain expansions adds the players to the base game.
Yeah, indeed. So we're talking about here the next topic on the list of discussion here is adding more players. And as Don rightly said, perhaps you have a big friend group and you need that extra player, or you just enjoy that big group social game experience. Then a number of games add these expansions with more players for you. For example, a game that I have, that I also have the expansion of, is a Blood Rage. This is a very, let's say, Viking-themed, sort of that kind of Norse mythology themed board game, where essentially, you're taking over and conquering the lands on the board until Ragnarok eventually comes and destroys the world. Now, this is a 4-player base game, and the expansion adds a 5th player. It doesn't add really mechanically wise anything different. There are a few cards that are added to the drafting, so perhaps it gives you maybe 1 or 2 new strategies, but essentially it's just the extra player. Now, does this make the game better? In a way, I feel like if there are more people on the board, then it's more engaging. Okay, what kind of strategy am I going to take now? Am I going to go for that particular land to conquer, or am I going to go for that land to conquer? It adds more in the sense that you've got a full, maybe a little bit crowded board to play on. And if you had to take the base game, 1 player, you actually cover a number, 2 players, you actually cover a number of regions on the board. So you're playing in a smaller space just so that it's more crowded. With 3 players, same thing. You're covering a space so that you can have a more crowded space to play on, right?
I think this adds a more chance, especially for Blood Rage, it adds the chance of combat between players to happen more than anything.
Yes.
While the base game, once you're all 4 players, there is a maybe chance that you're going to be fighting for space more than if you were fewer players. With a 5th player, it's all-out war. That's how I feel about it. That's the cool part that they add to the theme of adding the 5th player in that expansion.
Yeah, and I feel like it warrants. I feel like it does warrant that to the game because Vikings, notoriously known for being bloodthirsty, going into battle. If you're not playing the game like that, then I think you're playing it wrong thematically. And speaking about war and combat, the next example here is Spartacus. We've mentioned Spartacus before on the show, and it as well has an extra player expansion.
So Spartacus Blood and Treachery we're talking about here, the game that's based off the Stars show. Basically, it's a 3 to 4 player game. That is the base game. You're playing as 4 different characters from the series, which are basically Rome leaders, or so to speak, people who want to reach into the Senate. When you're trying to reach the popularity of 12 influence. What the expansions do is they add more players. So they realize this, and there's more chance for more people to enjoy this experience. And truly enough, you don't lose anything from having more players on onto the board. What I know for sure is that because there's more players involved, sometimes especially in the arena phase, there's more chance of people just staring while this phase ends. So this is where the other mechanics came in to shake up a bit the game in new ways. But we'll talk about that in a bit. So basically what we're looking at is sometimes you love a board game so much and you can see the opportunity for more players to join onto this board game, but unfortunately the board game itself doesn't permit it. So what this does is the expansion allows more players to come in, So you have a bigger experience, and I think sometimes more players in some board games is better. In other board games, it just makes the game more dragging, unless they put in the right mechanics the way Spartacus did to make everyone feel included.
Yeah, definitely, because having more players also means having more downtime, more twiddling your thumbs in between other players taking their turns. And believe me, some players take their time to play their turn, which can get annoying. But in the long run, for some games, their input is really good. And a game that I think of that perhaps adds players in a way that is really good, however, does suffer from the downtime, is Heroes of Land, Air, and Sea. Now I have this game myself in my collection, and it's a great game. It's land conquering. It's got some great miniatures and really great board, and the expansion even offers a wider board to add more of the players here. And having the extra players is really good in the sense that, as we mentioned before with Blood Rage, more battle forces people into more scenarios where, okay, it might not just be conquering the land on just my islands that I need to win, or just building my towers to win, but I also have to engage in combat with other players. And I think it adds more more immersive feel into the game, right? And even adding more immersive feel, it adds tactical ideas. You're playing a tactical game. In the end of the day, you have to make decisions, and so having more players on the board like that, I think, adds an element of decision making, which otherwise with fewer players might not be there.
Yeah, something that's I think is also to be mentioned is Scythe. Scythe has an expansion. By the way, it's so in your face, the base game, that says, hey, we're giving you 4, but there's another expansion that gives you another 2.
Yeah,
I'm just saying, that is just in your face. Like, here you go, you need to buy the expansion if you want all of the pieces that belong to the board. Now, mind you, you do not need to buy this just for the sake of having them, right? If the base game works for you, just use the base game. I only have the base game, and it works simply fine. Scythe is not for everyone, by the way. It is a very heavy strategic game.
Yes.
Where you have to plan out your turns. It is long for people to kind of decide what they're going to do, analyze the board, where they're at the time, what achievements they still need to achieve, and so forth. So adding more players may actually hinder the experience and actually prolong the game time itself. So if you're going for this expansion specific and you're going to utilize all players on the board, first and foremost, you have more chance of combat happening. So that's kind of the only fun part about it, because it adds that new element of, oh, okay, so now I have to start thinking more on a defense or an offensive way of dealing with things on the board. However, other than that, mechanically speaking, it adds nothing more than just adding players to your table.
Yeah, indeed, because you can either play a 2-player game and possibly not even go into combat once, right? Or you can play the full game with the expansion and all the extra players, and then be really on edge about, okay, who's attacking me next, or who am I attacking next, and how do I defend, and oh my god, it just runs.
Adds more stress in that aspect of, you have to watch your back and your next step, where you're gonna go. If you think in the whole 6-player experience that you're going to come up to a point where you want to avoid combat, forget it.
Yeah.
If you're late in the game, you're gonna have to face certain people whether you like it or not.
Most definitely. And actually, I'd like to move on now. We've mentioned, expansions that add more stuff and expansions that add more players in particular. But we also have to acknowledge here the biggest, I think, component and type of expansion is those expansions that add new mechanics to the game. Now, listeners, I know we've mentioned it, and possibly even every single one of these expansions that we've mentioned so far and examples have included mechanics with them. However, what we want to talk about specifically here, putting aside the overlap, is specifically expansions that change the core mechanic of the game.
Well, I wouldn't say change the core mechanic. It's more adding to the core mechanic, adding new possibilities to win, and new rules that definitely you have to abide by once you have these expansions on board.
Definitely. Like, come to mind Dead of Winter, a game that you and I both love, and its expansion adds a couple of new threats to the board and the graveyard, which are new mechanics that do change the game around a little bit, don't they?
So basically, Dead of Winter is a survival game. As it says, you're in the dead of winter, and it's deadly because you're surrounded by these zombies. However, the expansion that comes with it, right? So it can be played as a standalone as well if you want to. However, if you are going to add this to the base game itself, you have 2 new threats. So why the base game just introduces just zombies and you have to worry about that and whatever you have to achieve, and you have to make sure everyone's fed, and you have to make sure all the threats at the time, it's quite loading with stress, even just mentioning it, I'm breaking a sweat.
Indeed, yeah, definitely.
And it's not just because it's hot in this room. It adds 2 new threats. By the way, these are something you can add if you want to. You don't have to really abide by them. You can leave them out, but you really have to start looking through the whole components that adds onto it to make sure thematically it's out. You have the threat of the zombies, which comes with the base game, as I said, but then you're adding the threat of people. What are they called? Are they mentioned? No. The bandits. So basically, the bad guys are traveling around this, blizzard town of snow and just causing more hassle.
But it also adds a traitor, doesn't it?
The traitor was always there.
The traitor was always there.
None of that doesn't change.
Right.
You just have new traitor cards, right? That you could possibly join the bandits. You can become leader of the bandits. And stuff like that. However, there's also the mutated zombies. So you thought the normal zombies were fine to deal with. Now there's a mutated version, which basically means that you have to find a way how to find a specific cure, experimental pill, or whatever to deal with these zombies. Otherwise, some zombies can be quite deadly once you reach the mutated version. So all of a sudden, the game has become not only as stressful as it currently is, but now it's just come completely deadly. I mean, whoever came up with this just said, no, if you had that's 25% of winning, I want to slim it down to 10.
Deadly game indeed, and definitely on top with that list of let's say very heavy board games, I would say, especially with all the expansions there.
Yep.
Put in. Moving on to perhaps a lighter game and example for adding new mechanics, we can look at Splendor. Now I can't say everybody, but we know Splendor as being that game where, you're collecting gems and you're going around trying to collect enough points to win at the end of the game. And with the expansion that comes along with Splendor, it adds a new element of how to win the game. And specifically...
So... let's explain what Splendor really is, right? So Splendor is a bunch of cards, right? That you are... think of it like Rummy, but with a buying mechanic of chips with different colors to purchase them. So basically, you have the chips come in first, you choose a couple, then you exchange them for cards on the table. Those cards are going to create discounts for future cards, and then as you go up the level of the cards have points. The first person to reach 15 points plus win the game. You want to take it to an extra level. The first person who reaches 15 plus and not 15 points, and not more, officially win the game. If you go over 15 points, you lose the game. There's that variety as well. However, the expansion introduces a new mechanic to the game, which basically gives you a new alternative way to win. And this is basically holding down cities, building certain wonders and all this stuff. So basically, there's a third element of how to win the game, so to speak. I'm not going to go into much detail of it. It is a family-friendly game, Splendor in itself. I think the new expansion is simply if you're just bored of playing the same thing. It's like when you come to a point and you're fed up of playing Rummy. You just start playing a variant of Rummy at some point, with the kitty and all this stuff. So this is what it does. This expansion just adds that extra way of like, oh, let's create a new way to win, make things a bit interesting, spin it around.
Definitely. And something that adds a way to win definitely brings in new strategies as well. And with new strategies comes a new example of a board game that adds new mechanics. And we have mentioned it earlier on in the podcast today is Heroes of Land, Air, and Sea. Now, as I mentioned, this is, a strategy and a land conquering, quite heavy combat game. And its expansion adds new miniatures and new mechanics to the way the game can be played. These come in the form of siege engines and monsters. Now, the game is played, it's quite, you collect resources, and then with your resources, you get to recruit your armies, and then you move your armies around the board, collecting more resources, and you're pillaging, and you're plundering, and you're building towers and whatnot, and you can do all of this. But with the expansion, you can buy siege engines that, might throw combat into your favor by adding stronger components of your army into the mix, and you can even recruit monsters, and each of these has their own set of mechanics, whether they fly, whether they move around, whether they collect different kinds of resources. They do something that influence the game in the long run. Now, I have to be honest, I've played this game with and without the expansions, and the time we played it with the expansions, honestly, we found ourselves not really using the expansion components. It's because the base game is such a good game in and of itself. You kind of forget about these extra components.
If I may actually interject here, because you mentioned them during the part where we were saying adding more players. Could it be that you were not in the expansion version of, listen, there's more players, therefore this can be utilized?
In what sense? What do you mean?
So what I'm saying here, and I'm not trying to oppose you or anything, I'm just trying to explore this possibility that perhaps these mechanics are there mostly because you need a new element to win if you're more players than the base game. Because seeing that you're saying you haven't really used them, perhaps you didn't jump into the fact that you're utilizing the extra player version into this expansion.
You can use these expansions on their own, in the sense that they can be added to the base game without the use of the extra player. So the extra player mechanic doesn't mean that you have to use these pieces, or these pieces come with the extra player mechanic. They're there for everyone, and which is why I think we included it with this section, because any one player on the board can utilize these new mechanics to give them an edge in combat, or to give them an edge on the board, have better dominance or conquering. It's not specifically related to just one player, and these mechanics come in with that one player, but they're available to anyone who wants them.
Yes, but what I'm saying is, like, for example, right, let's pick the expansion of Spartacus. So it adds new players, therefore, to avoid downtime, so to speak, during especially the combat phase, they've added this thing called the Primus, meaning that more players can come in to, fighting in the arena. Most of the time with the Primus, it's not just adding players, but it adds the element of, okay, now I have a better chance of winning because I've got this person on my side. Right? Other than that, really and truly, no one would use the Primus because it's sharing the possibility of a win with another player who might actually be closer to winning the game than you are.
I see. From that perspective, no, not really, because just like all the other pieces on specifically related to your player board, you recruit them with resources, or you recruit them by doing a particular step on your turn. So you're buying these, or you're recruiting these extra pieces into your army essentially on your turn, and you're moving them and you're playing them on your turn.
Okay. So it wouldn't be like, for example, then I'm going to really pick on you on this one, sorry, because I really want to understand better more than anything. Let's take Sight, for example. You know how the area gets overcrowded, so therefore, where before you weren't thinking of military, now you're going to start thinking of military because, it's crowded, and you have to start thinking, oh shoot, I have to start thinking to be more popular in military, getting more points there so I have more cards, just in case I start facing enemies. Could it be that you didn't really utilize them? And I think this is where the argument started off here. Possibly you didn't utilize this new mechanic simply because it wasn't called out for, because you weren't so many players that needed the call for this.
It might have been. We weren't the full capacity of what the game could be played as. So that is definitely a point for thought. We were quite a few players. I think we were 6 players in total playing that day. I think with the expansions it can go up to 8 if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, so you still were a lot of players.
We still were a lot of players, yeah.
No one utilizes.
And I mean, I tried to utilize them just because I knew they were there and they could add something different. Like, if I'm not mistaken, some of these add new mechanics in the sense that where a piece before couldn't fly, now it flies. Or where a piece before couldn't be in water, now it can. And that sort of thing. So instead of needing to build a boat and needing to put your stuff into that boat to travel to another land, you could just recruit this piece and then move this piece through the water anyway. Or whereas before you needed a flying machine to get from the baseboard up to the higher flying island, now you didn't need it because you could recruit the monster that flies anyway, right?
Right, okay.
So these are the kind of new mechanics that bring in new choices, new decisions. Might be there a little extra, unless perhaps maybe you're full experience with all the players. We'll have to see. This is still kind of a new game to the collection.
Because it's really pity, right? If the creators of the board game was like, I created this new expansion thing, created this new mechanic, I think it's really cool, people are gonna love it. Then people go like, and it's happened before, mind you. They was like, well, it doesn't really bring much change. I mean, okay, yes, it adds itty bitty bits here and there, but it's not like a new thing where everyone's fighting for, to get it.
Yeah, and if I could think of something that does that as well, in a way, I would say is Sheriff, specifically the first edition. There's a lot of expansions that come with that, and there's a whole bunch of new mechanics specifically into each little mini expansion within this overarching expansion that manipulates the gameplay in many different ways. However, at times they do feel a little extra in the sense that even if you don't go for them, you could still win the game.
Yeah, but they're still the ones to have them. I mean, I think the Merry Men in specific is part of the new mechanic in the expansion, right?
Yes, definitely.
You really want to have the Merry Men because it really gives you that edge. But, because of the paranoia that you're going to get caught, you're kind of just holding on to it. Just when the person's not, not at their best, they're kind of being too, not being too careful.
And one thing that I like about the Sheriff expansions in particular is that you don't have to use all of them. You can mix and match with different mechanics that you feel fit your style of gameplay with your group of friends you're playing with that particular time. So for example, you mentioned the Merry Men. If your friend group is particularly really good at being deceiving, and lying, essentially, because that's what Sheriff is. It's basically you have a number of goods and you're trying to get the goods past the Sheriff. Now, obviously, contraband goods can make their way into your cart and into Nottingham, but you have to make it past the Sheriff. So if you're good at lying, good to you. Now, some people go the other route and bribe the Sheriff. I find that to be a little bit, obvious at times, sometimes.
But sometimes the person would rather have the gold, something that they can keep in their pockets.
Most definitely.
Rather than punishing you.
Yeah, and this is kind of about the gold, really. So there's an expansion that I feel adds a lot more than the Merry Men, is with the specific, the orders. There's So imagine there are customers within Nottingham that have specifically ordered 3 apples and a crossbow, right? If you manage to bring all those goods into Nottingham, then you can take that special order and then you can reap the benefits at the end of the game. And it's just there passively while you're playing the base game and adds a lot more than a merryman trying to get him in just for the benefit of the merryman. You know what I mean?
Fully agree, yeah. So there are these components in board games which adds new elements of winning, new elements of mechanics, new possibilities. and new fun, obviously, to a game that you've already experienced prior, to make things, more flavored, so to speak, for the game. One game that's in mind comes when it comes to new mechanics, but altering the game a bit too much as you start going from expansion to expansion. Seven Wonders. Seven Wonders is basically you can be up to 7 people, and it's a drafting mechanic system. So basically, people are going to collect cards, and they're going to lay them down and pass them over to the next player, getting new cards from the player adjacent to who passed the cards, and you're going to select new cards. And obviously, through resources, through selection of cards, combination of cards, so on, you start building your point base. You can also advance your wonder sheet by throwing away a card to advance on the wonder that gives you either points or benefits, and basically that's the game. At the end of 3 whole rounds, right? So basically once all 3 piles have been depleted, everyone counts their points. The one with the most points wins. Now, what does the expansions do? Expansion adds new tiles, meaning there's new mechanics and therefore changing up the game completely. How so? Like, for example, one of the expansion adds these leaders, so historical figures like Caesar, Cleopatra, and other historical figures. And basically, they will change up the aim of how you want to win the game, and they will give you also bonus points. Some wonders require that you have a collection of a certain amount of leaders. Others give you if you're in certain depth, because it adds that new mechanic depth, and therefore you get to ignore it. There are all these new mechanics that change up the game completely, changes up the strategy of what you're going forward with. So something like this is not only adding to the game, but also changing the way the game originally felt like like having a new board game altogether with these expansions.
Yeah, talking about having a new board game altogether, without going to our honorable mention just yet, I'd like to bring up Small World, in the sense that I have one of the expansions of Small World, which is in fact the seafaring one. I forget the name specifically, but it adds a whole new board to play on. So whereas before Small World, you've got your the different tribes, and you're mixing and matching the tribes with different abilities, and you're conquering the land within this small world, literally. It shoves away that board to the side, that whole land, and it introduces a new board that you play on. Now this board has lakes and seas, and whereas before you could only conquer the sea if you were a particular race, in this one anybody can conquer the sea, so that adds a whole new mechanic to it. Besides the board and besides that mechanic, it also adds a new way on how to count the turns. So whereas before you just move a turn counter from the number of turns all the way down to 0 to the end of the game, and then you count up your points, this one, the turn counters are specifically affect the weather. So at the beginning of the turn, you randomly choose the number for the number of turns that you're going to have for this game, and then at the start of each round, you flip it over, right? And then depending on what is on that, you could have weather problems. So it could be a calm sunny day and nothing happens. It could be a stormy winter weather, and it's going to affect how you traverse the seas. It could be very windy and affect how you traverse the seas, and then it adds this whole mechanic there as well. But not only does it add all of that, it even adds new tokens, of course, because you're going to be exploring the seas and you're going to be conquering the seas, and so the seas are dangerous, and you have new quote-unquote like NPC pieces on the board that move around the lakes that you must fight, of course, in order to conquer. So it changes the game quite a lot, from the sense that there's a new board, new pieces, new timekeeping mechanics. The core mechanic, kind of stays the same, because before you had to conquer the land, now you had to conquer the land, but now you're doing it with a lot more steps in between. It's an interesting take on it. I would say if you get bored of the base game, this is a great one to add, but what do you think, Don?
Oh, definitely. It's something to definitely try out. It's for those people, again, expansions, I think, in my opinion, is there when you are fed up of a game, but you don't want to let it go, and you want to spice things up because it's your favorite game, I think that's when the expansions come in. Alternatively, it's to add new players because your group has become bigger. There are these varieties, right, that you could go for an expansion for these different reasons. Unless you're one of me, which basically is just for the sake of collecting.
Yeah, the sake of collecting is always a good reason to delve into the expansions. Now, sometimes if you have, we will bring this point up before and then we'll end on an honorable mention. If you have a base game and the base game is already an amazing and awesome, such a great game, how do you expect the expansion to live up to the greatness that the original game set for you? Can it?
Sometimes the board game is enough to have the experience you need. Sometimes the expansion ruins the board game.
Yeah, I agree.
There are, I mean, it's not for everyone. Some people say, okay, the expansion made things much better. There are sometimes it changes the game to the point where it's no longer the game you loved. I can think actually of one expansion that I don't think I want to touch because it changes the game a whole lot, and that is Role Player.
Mm-hmm.
The expansion for Role Player adds the intervention of monsters to the whole thing, which changes the whole game in aspect of you're there to build your perfect character sheet, and the one who does so will receive a certain amount of points and therefore win. Now you're adding the element of you've not yet built your character yet, and you're battling monsters off to get more points. I think it adds an extra stress and changes the way you look at the board game as not a character sheet building game, but now it's something a bit different. It's more like an RPG, like we mentioned in the past episodes.
Yeah, and sometimes if a great game is great and it does well, then is there really much need for an expansion? Because at that point, other than doing it for money's sake, so we made a lot of money on the base game, let's introduce an expansion to gain more money from the expansion. I honestly don't feel like that works, and there are ways around it. And if you really want to add a new game into your line of collection for the sake of, the first one did great, made a lot of money, let's add another one, then we will go to our honorable mention, and that is standalone expansions.
Ding ding, let's fight.
Yeah, we had a little bit of a disagreement.
Yes, this is why the episode started a bit me sounding so salty. Okay, Ben, you go ahead. You start on this.
Okay, so I believe that the standalone quote unquote expansion, because I don't want to give into this. I really don't like them called as expansions because they're standalone games, right? The base game was great. The base game is amazing. Let's stick with the base game. You liked, if people liked some of those mechanics that were introduced in the base game, go ahead, make another game, but don't call it an expansion of the first game. I believe that standalone games are made to be standalone, and unless there has a piece or a mechanic or something that works with the base game that you can't play without the base game, it isn't really an expansion in my book.
So we understand that an expansion is an add-on to an existing game. Yes?
Yes,
right.
We understand that.
So, now sometimes these standalone board games that are also considered expansions are considered expansions because you can add on to the base game. It doesn't really change anything much. Perhaps there's new ways of winning, or it doesn't really change too much. It's just changing the perspective of the game itself, but the core mechanics stay the same components. Is just you have different perhaps outcomes that you need to achieve because of these standalone ones. Now, for example, I mentioned Dead of Winter. Now, Dead of Winter, the expansion, adds new threats. However, it can also the second game that came out, so you had the first and the second, and then you had the actual expansion. The second game can be considered as a standalone as well because
I will just point out before you continue there.
Lord.
You said the first game, the second game, and then the actual expansion. Your words, Don.
Yes, but here's how it works with Dead of Winter in specific. You can have the second game without having the first, because it's a whole new experience on its own. If you have the first, you have more components to deal with, and therefore expanding on the stuff. Actually, I love the stuff from the components of the second game better than the first, simply because things are made out of cardboard, not paper. Now, the third game, which is the proper expansion, is to include both board games against each other, because it's opposing colonies. So that's the purpose of the actual expansion, so to speak.
Okay, so essentially here you have two standalone games, two completely different editions of the game that just so happen by chance run on the same theme and have the same mechanics, and then you have an expansion that joins them together.
Yeah.
Yeah, the expansion
it's not
is
the second
what
edition,
joins them
just
together.
saying.
Yeah.
Because second edition is improving the mechanics and the stuff already from the first game, like Sheriff, second edition, right? And there's other board games that did this and card games. This is not a second edition. Here's an expansion you can add on to the board game, but you don't need the base board game.
Yeah, this is listeners, where we completely disagree. And before we get into a fight here in the studio over this, we're going to end the episode here. We have raised some great points about expansions and the different things of expansions.
We didn't even mention the game we were actually fighting about.
We didn't even mention the game that we are fighting about, listeners. But if you're curious, follow us on our socials. You can ask us there. We will definitely be transparent, and we'll continue the discussion. If you're interested, we can
live stream it if you want.
Yeah, we can definitely live stream this. If you want to add more to this discussion yourselves, listeners, for probably a look at expansions in a future episode, we'll do a part 2. Mm-hmm. We'll take your suggestions either on our Discord, on any of our socials, or if you want to join our Patreon and have a direct influence in what we do and how we do that, you can find us on patreon.com/PlayUpMT.
Thank you also to our sponsors who are always supporting us, which is the Miniature Corner Studio. They do 3D printing for custom-made 3D printing for all of you listeners. They do a 10% discount code, which reflects on PlayUp21. Also, we have the Giants Tower.com, which also print miniatures. However, they are more thematically based. So themes like Egyptian themed, Viking themed, and all of that stuff. They do terrain and all that stuff. And they have the discount code of PlayUp15. All uppercase PlayUp15 if you want to use that discount code just to get your figurines from them. Last but not least, we also like to thank one of the people who have been supporting us for as long as we've been around doing events and such, is WarmongerGamesMalta.com. They have everything, related to board games, RPGs, miniatures, you name it. They sell it. Head over to their website, WarmongerGamesMalta.com, and for this month, okay, we can just cut it there. You can edit it. Okay. There's no thing this month. No, for this episode. No,
not for this episode.
Thank you everyone for listening, and hopefully you enjoyed listening to us. Tune in to the next episode next week.
Take care.
Ciao. Grab your hand around my neck.